everyone, and welcome to Module 1 of the Reinvention program, the coaching program that's lasting for 6 months. I'm really excited to have you on board. If you're in the Reinvention Mastery, Oshante, I'm happy to have met you because we had to go through a one-on-one to fully understand why you need to have a one-on-one coaching session every week. And if you're on the Reinvention Essentials, I'm looking forward to meeting you on our first group coaching. That happens every twice a month, so that's every 2 weeks. And I'm really looking forward to getting started with you people and answering all of your questions. And just a quick one. So, in addition to this video training, we have um, a text version just below the video, and it's more or less an abbreviated version of the video version. So I highly recommend that you run through the entire video because it's more elaborated and it's expansive, and plus you can come back to it as often as you want. And the text version you can download and take with you. If you're in a rush and you're going to be out and about, when you have time, you can read it at your own leisure. Anyway, everything is accessible for you 24/7, and it's a lifetime thing. So no worries there. And also, really, really important to know and understand is that at the end of every module, I need you to follow through on the prompts that you would see at the end of the module, which is doing the assignments. If you're on the Reinvention Mastery, this is highly integral for you to follow because our one-on-one consultation is going to be based off of what you have learned uh, this week, every week that we're meeting, and it's sort of a launch pad for starting to do a diagnostic of your space and understanding what your spaces need, unique to you. So it's really, really important for Reinvention Mastery students to follow through um, in anticipation of our one-on-one. And also, do not forget to book your slots as early as you can, so that there's no overlaps and there are no issues. Yeah. So having said that, I'm really excited to get started with you. Let's move on to the program. Right. Welcome back. Module 1 is the introduction to the cognitive benefits of interior design. And in this module, we're going to be running through how the brain processes spatial environments. We're going to talk about hormonal sensitivity and spatial environments. We're going to be looking at the parts of the brain that are responsible for certain processes in our as environmental triggers, and how the parts of the brain that's responsible for processing those environmental cues. And we're going to be looking at environmental psychology basics. It's not a university level anything. It's just for you to understand the basics of environmental psychology. And then we'll run through practical strategies to optimize your space. And then we'll set wellness goals for the home. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're in the mastery, don't forget to book your coaching call slot. And if you're on the Reinvention Essentials, don't forget to show up for your group coaching. Also, Reinvention Mastery students are free to show up for the group coaching that happens every fortnight. However, this is exclusively for the people on the essentials because this is the time that they ask their questions and have their questions answered. All of your questions in the Reinvention Mastery are answered during our one-on-one coaching. Yes? Right, so let us move on through. Let us move on through what you would have learned by the end of this module. So by the end of the module, you would have understood how your spatial environments influence your brain function, particularly during hormonal changes such as in perimenopause. You would have grasped the principles of environmental psychology and the effect on emotional and cognitive health. And we would set actionable wellness goals for improving personal spaces to enhance mental clarity and focus, either by yourself on the essentials, with me on the mastery, both parties have access to the guide and the workbook that's available to download in this module. Right, so let's jump right in. How how does your brain process spatial environment? So a really important thing to understand is that there is an intimate connection between your brain, your body, and the environment. They're so very intimately connected, and at every given moment, your brain is collecting and processing such a vast amount of information from your environment, which is your immediate surrounding. And this information comes through all your sensory systems, your eyes, your ears, your sense of smell, your tactile capabilities, that's your touch, your sense of touch, and even your body's awareness of its position in space. That's your spatial awareness. And this sense is called proprioception. And when all of the senses work together, they provide the brain with a detailed map of your environment. And so, how does your brain do this? Your brain is constantly scanning your environment. So your spatial environments, like for instance, the arrangement of furniture and elements within your space, the design of that space itself, and the feel of your space, that's the emotional connection you have to your space, they profoundly impact the way that our brains works, because our brain is not just, it's not just passively receiving information. It is such a complex organ, and it's actively interpreting its cues, it's prioritizing what's important, what's not important, and it's constantly responding to the cues in our surroundings. And this influences our thoughts, it influences our memory function, it influences our emotional regulation, it influences all of our sensory experiences. So it's really, really important, because this is such an important organ that is the core and the nexus of the way that we function in our everyday lives. So now let's move on to exploring our senses and the sensory inputs that come through them, and the key brain areas that are responsible for processing the sensory inputs. So the first is our visual cue, which plays a dominant role, because when you step into a room, the part of your brain called the occipital lobe that you see here, don't know if you can see my arrow. This part of your brain, it's located in the back of your brain, and it rapidly, very quickly decodes visual inputs like how your space is laid out, whether there's a lot of visual clutter, the kind of color scheme. It's processing the wavelengths of color. It's basically just processing. It's processing the energy signatures of your space. It's processing the lighting levels, whether it's too harsh or too soft or just right. For example, when you walk into a cluttered room, it creates visual noise, and it makes it harder for this part of your brain, the occipital lobe, to focus, because it's constantly trying to assign, meaning to every object in space in relation to one another. So, so this is really important. And and in contrast, when the space is clean and organized, and and easy to decode by the brain, it provides fewer distractions, and it allows your brain to function at an optimal level. The second is the auditory cue, which is controlled by the temporal lobe, and this is located on the sides of your brain, like right here, and it processes sound. The auditory cue, and how our brain processes auditory cues and how it affects us if it's too much or if it's too much is when, for instance, if you have continuous low level background noise that is unwanted by you, that's not created by you, it competes with your ability to focus. And because your auditory system is constantly monitoring for potential threats, it starts to sort of divert attention away from the task at hand. And, and it's busy processing those external noises as whether it is safe or dangerous. And so you want to minimize external noise, especially if you have ADHD. I have spoken with a few of my clients here who have ADHD, and The auditory cue is so, so important. I also have ADHD, and I know just how important it is for me to insulate my space against um, external intrusive sound. So the auditory cue for me is really important for people with ADHD and everyone, but it's more sensitive in some people than in other people. And the third is tactile and spatial awareness. So this tactile and spatial awareness function carries on in the parietal lobe over here. We can see my arrow, but you can see it's highlighted here in the little white circle. And this integrates tactile sensations like, for instance, how fabric feels, how your chair feels, how surfaces feel, and it also does that in relation to your body's position in space. So when you're in a cramped or uncomfortable space, for instance, or you're constantly having micro aggressions, like say like a really rough surface, you're constantly rubbing against a rough surface, it can heighten feelings of tension and unease because your brain is constantly your brain interprets that as um, threats to your safety or restricted movement or anything that is not giving you a sense of safety. Your brain is interpreting that sense of touch as either safe or unsafe. Another really important way that our brain processes our spatial environment is through the limbic system. And the limbic system is also known as our emotional filter. The first is the amygdala, and it is located just right here in the brain. And this amygdala quickly assesses whether an environment feels safe or it feels threatening. So when you're in a dimly lit room, for instance, or you're in a cluttered room, because your amygdala is not able to immediately put together the cues to let you know whether it's safe or threatening, it can trigger stress levels. It might, if you already have low level stress levels, it might trigger that and spike it. And and this happens because your brain associates environments with reduced visibility with danger. But in contrast, when you walk into a well lit room or a nicely lit room with layered lighting, everything that needs to be seen is seen. It's seeing all of the it's able to coordinate itself within the space. Your amygdala then interprets that as a place of safety, and it helps you feel calm and more focused. Now, moving on to the next part of the brain that is really important is the hippocampus. And this part of the brain over here, it's responsible for memory and context. And this region of our brain links our environmental cues to our memory. That is how, and this is how further down the line we're going to discuss this wayfinding cues and how our brain associates certain areas of the space as it starts to link certain parts of the space as safe or places where certain activities happen. This is hippocampus. It's This is the hippocampus. It's a really cool part of the brain, and we're going to elaborate on it much later. But here we're just touching on sort of I'm just running you through the basics of the parts of the brain and how they relate to your interior environment. So the hippocampus is connected to environmental cues and memory. So if your home office, for instance, is consistently messy, hippocampus associates that space with chaos. But if it's constantly organized, it associates it as, okay, so this is where I go to get some real serious focus work done. On the other hand, as well, if you have associated trained your hippocampus to associate, say, um, a corner in your space that you have created to be your meditation space, your hippocampus remembers that space as the space that it goes to rest and reflect and relax and just be calm. And it starts to relate the information to the rest of your body. saying that, oh, this is a safe space. This is where we meditate. This is the time. This is the time to release serotonin and just or melatonin, depending on what space you're in. And yeah, so it's a really, really cool part of the brain that we need to. That's really interesting to understand. Yeah, so now let us talk about why the brain craves order and why cognitive load, this concept called cognitive load. Your brain has a finite amount of memory, mental energy that's available to process information. And this phenomenon is known as cognitive load. So, if, for instance, you're in a chaotic or overstimulating environment, your brain's cognitive load increases exponentially and it becomes overwhelmed because it needs to work harder to understand what's happening around you. And that's why clutter is really, really important. And that's why also lighting levels is really important and noise levels are also super important because your brain can only process so much. And if it's overloaded, then everything's going to be in disarray, right? So, for example, like I mentioned earlier, clutter. Every item in the cluttered room is competing for your brain's attention subconsciously, and this forces your brain to continually process unnecessary information, leading to cognitive overload. And the same goes for noise when your brain can't understand the input that's coming in or it's constantly jarring. This this would overload your brain and by consequence, create chaos in the brain. And chaos in the brain leads to stress levels. Stress levels, you can't function with high stress levels. So, in contrast, when environments are orderly and they're well designed, they help to reduce cognitive load, and that frees up your mental energy for problem solving, for decision making, and for creative pursuits. And so that's that on part one. So let's move on to part two, which is hormonal sensitivity and how this is influenced by our spatial environments. So, in a nutshell, the effects of our environmental cues, that's environmental cues from sight, from sound, from tactile sensations, and so forth, they become even more pronounced during periods of hormonal change, like perimenopause, when our hormones our estrogen receptors are not getting enough estrogen input, and that's affecting brain function already. So it is really important to think about how our environmental cues are helping us in this time of perimenopause and not hindering. So hormonal fluctuations, for instance, like I said, affect the brain's neurotransmitter systems, which I will discuss in the next slides, which makes it more sensitive to external stimuli. The, really, the two important areas that we need to remember are the hippocampus. The hippocampus is right here, and this is responsible for memory and navigation. It processes spatial layouts and it helps you orient yourself within your space. And the second is your prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the large portion of the part of the brain called the prefrontal lobe. So the prefrontal lobe is this whole area that's highlighted. The prefrontal cortex is the large part of it, right at the front of our of the cranial cavity. And this part of the brain manages our decision making and concentration. And when it's overstimulated by visual chaos, it becomes fatigued, and that impairs our focus and productivity. Now, how does brain sensitivity um, relate to spatial cues? Now, our brain, like I said, constantly processes spatial cues, such as our lighting levels, noise, etc. And these directly impact our mental abilities and our ability to focus. So things like always clutter level, the type amount of clutter in your space, the lighting levels, and noise levels. And a quick research based information to help you further understand this is that on clutter, research shows that clutter increases cortisol. That's the stress hormone. Now, cortisol on its own is not a bad thing because every morning we need to have cortisol release to help us start our day and be productive throughout the day. But that's the baseline level of cortisol that we need to function during the day. But when we're exposed to um, cognitive overload, we start to experience a cortisol spike, and that increases stress levels, and that hinders our ability to um, remember things and to focus. Now, on lighting, it is really important to have access to natural light because natural lighting boosts serotonin. Particularly important for early morning natural light exposure, especially when you get into your eyes. Low level. There's this neuroscientist whose podcast I listen to. If you're interested, it's usually long form, but it's value packed. It's called the Huberman Lab, and he talked extensively about getting early morning sunlight exposure because um, the receptors in your eyes, the rods and the cones, I think it's the cones that are particular for this. When you get early morning sunrise, early morning, not sunlight that's overhead, low level sun exposure, like the sun's just coming up from the horizon. You get that into your eyes for 10 to 15 minutes without any barrier, like no window barrier. Get out into the open air. If you can't go out, if you have a balcony, step out onto your balcony. If you don't have a balcony, open your windows and make sure that you have direct, those photons are getting into your eyes. And this releases early morning cortisol and also boosts your serotonin levels. And it resets your circadian rhythm. That's your sleep wake cycle. And it helps you sort of get into the day and be more productive during the day, right? And that also enhances your mood and your alertness. And but in contrast, if you're not getting sun exposure, you're not and you're constantly exposed to dim or harsh artificial lighting, particularly, or insufficient amounts of light during the day, this contributes to fatigue and cognitive decline over time. Now, on the subject of sound and noise intrusion, so when you're continuously exposed to intrusive noise, this overstimulates your brain, which then reduces mental clarity. So even low-level background noises can decrease your productivity by up to 10%. If you're interested in the research, there's research the um, in the PDFs as further reading references. It's in there if you're interested. I recommend that you go read it. It would help you a great deal. Now let's talk about why it is so important. It is integral, not so important, for us in perimenopause and postmenopause to pay attention to these environmental cues because already in perimenopause we already have reduced dopamine efficiency, and this leads to challenges with our motivation and our focus, which then amplifies negative effects of clutter or poorly lit environments. And so it is important to not make these these effects worse and support them instead. And also, we're already dealing with heightened stress responses because our cortisol levels are changing, and our cortisol regulation during perimenopause um, means that clutter, noise, or overstimulation can even feel more overwhelming than usual. I have experienced this so many times, and I know that you have as well. And so it is so important to understand how these environmental cues make things worse as opposed to making things better, and how we can use them to make things better. And also, the third thing is that we're already experiencing lower serotonin levels because it's already affected by the hormonal changes that's going on in our bodies. And so, serotonin level depletion, it makes the brain more vulnerable to the effects of poor lighting or chaotic surroundings. So really important for us to understand and to it was really important to walk you through all of these steps so that we can understand the why we have these issues, the what they are, why we have these issues, and then we can talk about how we can resolve the problem. Yes. So what is the key takeaway here? The key takeaway here is that our spatial environments are such a dynamic factor that influences our brain's ability to function optimally, particularly during sensitive periods like hormonal transitions. And if if we find if we're able to put together a toolkit that we can take with us long after this program ends, and we understand, my hope is that by the end of this program you have all of the tools that you need, where you intuitively and you immediately understand that, oh, this is why this is happening right now, because this is going on in my space, because I'm doing that with my space, or I'm doing this with my awareness, and you can immediately address it and mitigate the challenge. And this is a hope that I have for you, and I'm really looking forward to working with those on the Reinvention Mastery Program, because it would give me such great joy to see your evolution in real time and help you recreate your space to fully support you. And then moving forward, you have that confidence and the tools and know-how to diagnose your space like that. That's amazing, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the program with you. So, what are the practical takeaways that you can take from this segment that we just ran through? Understanding how your brain processes spatial environment empowers you to create spaces that support your mental clarity and emotional well-being. So the key points for you to remember here are that clutter overstimulates your brain, lighting impacts your brain chemistry, quiet is critical to focus, and open spaces signal safety. Not wide open spaces. We're going to talk about the concept of open spaces later on. I think we're talking about it at some point in this module, but we're going to be talking about it deeply later on, and in your group the group chats, group videos, and also the one-on-ones as well. So let us move on to part three. That is environmental psychology basics. I promise it is just the basics. And so in this section, you would learn how design elements in your interior spaces can shape your emotions and your cognitive health. Environmental psychology, in simple terms, is the study of how our physical surroundings impact our well-being. Now for next pictures. I know you're probably going, where are the pictures? Yeah. So anyway, uh, key design element one in environmental psychology is the layout of your space. So when you have open, clutter-free layouts, they're easy to navigate around and offer clear wayfinding cues. And by wayfinding cues, it just simply means your ability to navigate your way through space and find places. Particularly important because we did a project back in school where the focus was on Alzheimer's patients, and wayfinding cues was really important for them to be able to easily navigate the space. But it's crucial for everyone. So I digressed on the wayfinding cues. So for instance, this is not everybody's cup of tea. Not my cup of tea. I'd like my spaces to have a bit more character, but this is for the purposes of showing an open clutter-free layout where you know it's open and it's clutter-free, as you can see. Where on the other hand, there's another type of layout space which is more interesting in some cases to creating zones and creating visual separation between spaces. If you're into that, there are opportunities for zoning spaces in an open plan space using all sorts of amazing interior design strategies and tools, which we would discuss if you'd like in either the one-on-ones or group coaching sessions. However, but enclosed spaces like this one are easy to create zones, like I said, and also areas of concentration. So, for instance, you have this zone here, that's like the sitting area. You have this little, if you can see this etagere, That's French. This bookshelf here, this open bookshelf where it's sort of, you can have, there is a visual continuity, but there's also some kind of separation, and that way you can zone out the space without really like closing off the space. There's lots of potential for closed spaces. They don't need to be completely closed, but they can be. You can have visual separation. You can apply that as well to open plan spaces, but that's a chatter for another time. And we're short on time on the presentation here. I don't want to take too much of your time talking too much. Right, let's move on to key design element two, which is color, one of my favorite topics of all time. And on color, our brain processes and interprets the visual signals from our eyes, allowing us to distinguish colors and assign meaning to them. And this goes on through this area called the occipital lobe. It's in the back of the brain. And when light, this is the mechanism, when light enters the eyes, it enters through photoreceptors in the retina, which then absorb these light waves. And these signals are sent to the brain through the optic nerve. I don't know if you can see my arrow. The optic nerve runs from the eye. This little nerve thing runs from the eye all the way to the occipital lobe, which then processes and interprets visual information, which also includes color perception. It's a very cool, very, very cool process in the brain. And I love that it's in the back of the brain as well. I can't explain why, I just love it. um, so yeah, so let's talk about types of color. So warm colors tend to be on the long wavelength, meaning they have a longer wavelength. They sort of project further out into the space. And for examples like red, oranges, and yellows, they're usually associated with feelings of excitement, of energy, and warmth because they're more energetic in terms of, if we're talking energy signatures, warm colors are more energetic, and that's why they project further out into space, and you can perceive it. It's got a stronger energy signature. Whereas on the other hand, you have cool colors like blues and greens and purples, and these are on a shorter wavelength or on the mid wavelength. For instance, green is known to green has been shown to sit on a mid wavelength. It's one of the balanced colors on the color wheel, and that's why it's used a lot in relaxation spaces and spas. It's really good for relaxing. Green is my favorite color, and there is a reason why plants have leaves in the color green. And when you go to the tropics, it's green everywhere. You just have this sense of, oh, God, this is just an amazing space to be. That's the power of green. But I digress there. So cool colors like blues and greens and purples, among other colors, are associated with feelings of calm, tranquility, and relaxation. And as I said, more specifically, green has been found to have a very calming effect on the brain. It reduces stress and anxiety because it's sat on the mid wavelength. That's why. And blue has also been shown to increase productivity and focus, which makes it a popular choice for office spaces and study environments. And another cool area of research in neuroscience of color has focused on the role of color in our memory and cognition. And these studies have shown that color can significantly impact our ability to remember and process information. So, for example, you're more likely to retain information presented in color than in black and white. I know how I know how this looks because because the font is in black and white. However, that's why we have voice. So, and if you I'm sure everybody does this. I do this when I'm reading and I want to remember something. I highlight it in a colored felt pen. Everybody, most people do it. I don't know if everybody does that, but most people do it. And the reason why we intuitively do it is because it helps us to remember, right? So this is a really cool piece of neuroscience research that I felt like I needed to share with you. And let's move on to key design element three. That is texture and materials. That's how we feel and sense textures in our space. So at its most basic level, information about texture is transmitted from sensors in our skin and through the nerves to the somatosensory cortex that is highlighted here, somewhere in the middle of the brain. And this is responsible for interpreting our sense of touch. Now, our fingertips are such a cool tool for sensing texture. And our fingertips use these things called mechanoreceptors to sense characteristics in texture. So the receptors are divided into two. So you have the slow adapting receptors, which detect static touch from coarse textures like say brick or um, coir or sisal textures. And while the fast adapting receptors respond to dynamic touch, that's like when your fingers just sort of glide over a surface like silk or velvet or some types of wool textures. And this just sort of or glass as or glass for instance, that has a different sort of sensory experience to warm textures like silk and wool and velvet. But yeah, the fast adapting ones detect smooth textures. Oh yeah, so let's move on. And this somatosensory cortex, it processes these tactile sensations from interacting with surfaces, like I said, that influence our levels of comfort and our sense of safety. So, for instance, when you sit in a nice, soft, buccal seat made from wool or velvet, it gives you a sense of comfort and a sense of getting a hug, and that interprets as feelings of safety and calm. Whereas when you're, and this is what I was talking about with the glass texture and sensory experiences. If it's like a hard texture, like metal or concrete or glass, for instance, these can feel cold and uninviting unless they're paired with a soft texture. So you have that interplay of smooth and hard, soft, smooth and rough, soft and hard. But I tend to favor for residential environments and the mood and the feeling of safety you're trying to create in your space to always um, err on the side of using soft textures because that's just it's a no-brainer. It creates a sense of safety and calm, just safety in general. So those are usually much, much, much better for residential spaces. Now let's move on to how our emotional responses to our interior spaces. So, and this is on the subject of textures. So textures in our spaces can evoke specific emotions, like I had been talking about earlier. So this is elaborating on the points that I made earlier. Soft fabrics, for instance, like velvet or fleece or wool, create a feeling of coziness and intimacy. Rough surfaces, for instance, like brick and unfinished wood, can create a sense of ruggedness and authenticity. So, again, touching on the point of the sensory experience that you're creating and how it is paired with other textured environments, other textural surfaces in the environment. So, it's not a hard and fast rule. So, if you, for instance, combine soft fabric with a hardwood surface, hardwood on its own, the visual and sensory, the visual and sensory experience of hardwood is akin to biophilia. We're going to talk about that later. So it's not so much the texture, the rough texture of wood. It's more there's a more complex thing going on in the brain when it's interpreting visual and textural cues, and it's complex, but let's keep it simple. So for the sake of understanding just the basics and digging deeper when we are asking more questions or when we're going further into the um, program. And so, yeah, so that's on rough surfaces. On sleek materials like glass and polished stone, these can feel modern or sophisticated, and but sometimes it can feel clinical and uninviting. With varied Varying effects depending on the context. Like I said earlier, how they're paired, the impression you're trying to give, the feeling that you're trying to create in your space as well. Now, when we combine different textures, this was what I was talking about earlier. When we combine different textures, we create visual and tactile diversity, which enriches our sensory experiences in our spaces. For instance, when you layer textures using a mix of materials, like, for instance, wooden textures, wooden furniture, hardwood furniture with soft cushions for a text or a textured rug underfoot, these can create depth and interest, and this draws individuals into the space and it draws you into that environment that you're creating. And also, when you have contrasting textures like smooth surfaces, let's say glass, paired with rough textures, you can produce a dynamic effect which stimulates tactile exploration and engagement. So again, it's all about context and what you're trying to create in your space and what you're leaning towards, and which is why we have so many different design styles that many different people resonate with and some don't. So yeah, so it's still all down to individual preferences and how your unique needs are demanding of specific curation of space to support you in your space individually and uniquely. So, and the third element is biophilic design. So, biophilic design all simply is introducing nature inspired textures, forms, and shapes into your spaces, such as wood or stone or natural forms and shapes, which can induce a calming effect and then promote emotional well-being and reduce stress. And this aligns very well with biophilic design principles, which advocate for introducing and incorporating natural elements into interior spaces to enhance your mood and health. So now that we've talked about texture and color and sound, let's move on to practical strategies that you can use today to optimize your space. So the first step, I I cannot reiterate enough how this first step is super, super important. And by now, I hope that we understand why it is really, really important to declutter, visual and spatial clutter. You remove unnecessary items from high use areas like your desktop or your bedside table or your high traffic areas. And if you're space challenged, use use closed storage to hide visual distractions. And this is where built-ins come in and shine bright. When you have built-in furniture, built-in closet spaces, you can very easily just put all of your stuff away, even if you're not ready to deal with the clutter. I've done it a few times of year. There have been times when I have accumulated a fair amount of clutter, and it's interfering with everything that I've mentioned earlier, and I just need to have my space decluttered to suite. And so I have like pushed everything into my closet and shut the door. And that's instant decluttering. And I can always go back to decluttering later. This is real life scenarios here. So I'm not expecting you're not expected to be perfect all the time. There will be days when clutter will just build up for the sake of just clutter building up because of life happening. But once you understand that this environmental trigger does this to your brain, which impacts your ability to function and focus in things, you're more than likely to do as I do sometimes, just push everything into the closet and shut the door and deal with it later, or take the time to declutter. So that's the first strategy that we need to focus on. Step two is to harness natural light. So the first thing you need to do is, I mentioned earlier, ex- make sure that you're exposed to early morning sunlight because that helps release early morning cortisol, which is really important for resetting your circadian rhythm. It also helps to release dopamine, which is also really important. So, how do you practically um, create your space such that it maximizes natural lighting within your space. So having a look at your space and arranging your furniture to make sure that the places that you have where you have the most activity have the most access to natural light. And that's where um, floor plans come in, where we have a look at your interior space, where your windows are, where all your functional zones are, and how we can restructure that space to maximize natural light. And another thing to do to harness natural, the ingress of natural light is to opt for sheer curtains that help to filter in natural light. You can either throw your sheer curtains open to let in the maximum amount of light. So when sometimes in the summer, or if you're in the tropical region or in a place where there's a lot of sunlight throughout the day and sometimes it can get overwhelming, those sheer curtains would filter in the natural light very beautifully so that it's just the right amount of light coming into your space. And you can also use Venetian blinds. I remember what my first apartment, I was obsessed with Venetian blinds, and I just wanted to use Venetian blinds for everything. Even my clients, I was suggesting I'll specify Venetian blinds for everyone. Yeah, it's a long story, and yeah, I found Venetian blinds to be useful in regulating lighting. It's not as aesthetically, depending on the aesthetics you're after. It's not as aesthetically pleasing if you're after a soft, inviting space, you know. But Venetian blinds are also really good at regulating the intensity of natural light that comes into your space. Step three is to incorporate biophilic design. I have a lot of plants in my space, and it is the best decision that I have made for myself, for my mental health. Adding greenery or natural materials like wood or stone elements to your space. I also have a water feature, a tabletop water feature that I turn on several times during the day. Sometimes when I'm home all day long, I keep it running, and it's just that background, that welcome background noise just does amazing things to my brain. It's so calming and so relaxing, and it's a welcome background sound that I desire. And so when you expose yourself to these natural elements, it helps to reduce mental fatigue and it helps to enhance your cognitive function. But you've got to choose the sort of natural elements that work best for you. I know that there are people out there who have difficulty keeping natural plants alive. I do not recommend artificial plants because it just does nothing for you. But if you absolutely must, natural, artificial plants that are very nature identical. They have a lot of those high end ones that you can purchase if you want, but I'm not going to recommend it. So, but you do you, you do you. So yeah, so just adding greenery or natural materials to your space would very greatly enhance your mental um, alertness and enhance your cognitive function. And step four is use color psychology. This is a whole thing. I am going to bring in a color psychologist to talk you through all the nuances of color psychology. And we're talking about color psychology later on in the modules, in the common modules, but it bears like having a whole conversation around it. And hopefully, it would be my invitation. The color psychologist coming on board would coincide with when we have the color psychology module. So that would be really great. So on the color psychology, just a quick overview is to opt for common colors like blue, which is great for spaces that require you to focus in a calm environment, and greens when you need to promote relaxation. And in terms of color, especially green, if you don't want to do your if you don't want to change your entire wall into green, you can introduce in nature green plants, nature into your space is a great way to infuse your space with green. Take, for instance, this image here. The walls are white, the floor is hardwood, but there's lots of green. So that green, it's still infusing your space with color, except that it's color powered by biophilia. And so, yeah, so a fun fact, like I believe I mentioned this earlier, green, the color green sits in the middle of the color wavelength, and it's a very balanced color. So that's it's a good fun fact to know. And also use neutral colors to minimize sensory overstimulation. Neutral colors are like the godfather of neutralizing overstimulation. If you do your entire space in nuances of neutrals, amazing. But always, I would say, always introduce a pop of color, like a common color, like a blue or a green, to just break the monotony of the neutral. Or if you just want full on neutral, you can add visual interest with texture. That's also a really great way to um, add interest, visual interest to neutral schemes. So yeah, that's a top tip for you. And step 5, create functional zones. So it's important to for it's important to define areas based on activities that you're carrying out. Again, um, back to what we when we talked about open layout spaces and closed layout spaces or semi-closed layout spaces, um, you can create functional zones without having closed off spaces. But it is important to train your brain to understand that this particular zone that I'm entering with this specific visual and textural and sound cues is for this purpose. And your brain understands that so that when you do enter into the space, it's your brain starts to release the neurotransmitters and the chemicals that are necessary for entering into that zone. So, for example, if you have a space that's dedicated to relaxation, you introduce soft, warm, low level lighting, relaxing colors, and soft, comfortable seating. And on the other hand, if it's for focus work, you know what to do. Yeah, so that's that on step 5. And extra top tips for you. If you've got a small or shared spaces, like you've got kids and you have a small space, using vertical storage is great for creating a clean, clutter-free space. You can store all of your kids' stuff in there. You can store all of your extra things in there, things that you don't need right away. You can always and use smart storage boxes to just sort of so you can identify what is, and you label them, put them in there so they're easy to access, so that you're not just tossing things into your vertical storage. You are labeling them so you know what where is and where what is, and so you're not overwhelming your brain. That's another important thing to remember. And yeah, and in order to make spaces feel bigger, use mirrors or reflective surfaces to create the illusion of space. Or use it intelligently, because when you use too much of a reflective surface and it is reflecting off of reflective surfaces that you need to not be reflecting, like a TV or your computer, then that's another kettle of fish. So intelligent use of mirrors and reflective surfaces is really, really important. And another important thing is to opt for portable solutions like rolling carts and foldable desks to maintain organization in shared or multi-purpose areas. And another top tip is to enhance your sensory layers. So, for instance, for sound, introduce white noise machines, or like I mentioned earlier, a water feature, any welcome sound that you find calming and relaxing, or that helps you focus and just get in the zone. Introduce that. Again, it's all about what works for you and not about a generic idea of what should work for everybody, because everybody is unique. So it is important to understand what works for you. And also on textures, you know, like I said, I need to remove this, but if this is recorded, then I haven't removed it. But you get the point on textures. Soft natural fabrics for cushions, rugs, blankets, to create tactile comfort for you and your loved ones, primarily for you. And so, part 5, this is a part where we set our wellness goals for your home. Now, this is where you have to download the journal prompt down below. It's downloadable. And it is important, again, for the mastery people, it's important for you to download these prompts and work on them prior to our meeting. And for the essentials students, also very important to work on it. If you have any questions, you can always send me your questions in email format. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Just don't overwhelm me with questions, just because a lot of your most or all of your questions will be answered in the group um, coaching. We have an hour and a half, which can run over to 2 hours depending on need, but the maximum is going to be 2 hours for the group coaching. So don't worry, and it's we are a small group of people for each block of time. I'm only focused on a small group of people so that everybody's questions are answered properly. So yeah, so your journal prompt is to think about a room that you spend the most time in. Ask yourself what elements in this room feel distracting to you or feel overwhelming, or conversely, what elements feel calming. Write this down and write 3 things that you can do to improve and 1 change that you can make today. And after you've made that change, note down how you feel afterwards. Because your space has the power to transform your day and your entire life. So when you make intentional changes, you can create an environment that supports your cognitive health and your emotional well being, particularly during times of transition like perimenopause and postmenopause. Your home is your sanctuary starting today. Right. I believe that we've run through everything that we need to run through. Thank you so much for sitting in with me. I hope that you found this really, really helpful. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to send me an email. Looking forward to meeting you on the one-on-one if you're on the mastery. Looking forward to meeting you and answering your questions on the if you're on the essentials. Looking forward to meeting everybody, and I'm really excited to hearing your stories, your transformation stories, and how this program is helping you so far. It would be a great help to me, validation for me, and it will also be helpful for everyone else to encourage everyone else in your community to improve their environment, their home environment, to support their cognitive health. And that's all for this module. I will see you in the next module.